Hey y'all, I'm Lauren and welcome to Cantina Cast. Today I'm covering issues 5 through 7 of the High Republic Phase 2 comic written by Cavan Scott. This comic has been one of my favorite parts of High Republic Phase 2, and I talk about that some more in my first video that I made about this comic series when I was covering issues 1 through 4, but it's written by Cavan Scott. I've said many times that he's one of my favorite Star Wars writers. I feel like he does such a great job with this story and just creating really memorable characters that stick with you. Like, one of my favorite characters of High Republic, Tay Sirek, is featured in this series, and he really is one of the things that makes the series for me, just because he's just the type of character that I tend to really, really like. And so for that reason alone, this comic is worth reading, just because it's great storytelling. But in addition to that, this comic is very closely related to Path of Vengeance. And in my previous Path of Vengeance videos that I made, I highly recommended that you read this comic before Path of Vengeance, just because there's so many intertwining details that connect. Getting the backstories for some things that are revealed in Path of Vengeance, this comic goes into a little bit more detail at times. So pretty much this comic is a must read. Especially if you're reading other materials from Phase 2, this comic will be key. So if you haven't read it yet, definitely start with issue 1, go through the whole story, and I'll link my video over issues 1 through 4 in the description, so that way if you've read them before but it's been a while and you need a refresher, then that's down there for you as well. Starting with issue 5, which is called Falling Down. We left off back on issue 4 with there was a Force user who, because of the Leveler's influence, unleashed their powers into the crowd because they were having like hallucinations and things that the Leveler causes, which we all know at this point. But so that's where we left off with issue 4. And so with issue 5, we find out that this person who did this was a sorcerer of Tund. And Vildar Mak, the Jedi who has previously demonstrated to us that he's a little bit of a loose cannon and he's kind of unpredictable in what he's going to do, he's able to talk this sorcerer down and help them like snap out of the influence of the Leveler and kind of like get a little bit better of a handle on the situation. And while this is going on, Olivia, Maddie, and Master Liban, they're all there as well still while this riot is breaking out outside of the convocation. And they all come to the conclusion that whatever this feeling was that the Leveler is causing, it seems to have been deliberate. They don't know that it's a Leveler that caused it. They don't ever actually see the Leveler at this point, but they can tell that there was some sort of a deliberate thing that happened which made all of the Force users in the area react pretty negatively. So they do have a good sense that there is something going on here besides just a regular old riot. This riot does end up going to the Temple of the Kyber, and there's some looters who, the characters in the comic, they refer to them as raiders. So there's some raiders that break into the Temple of the Kyber. And while they're doing that, that does give Scoot, Tay's droid, a chance to get in and let Tay out. So Tay is able to escape from being held in prison. And when Tay is making his way out of the prison, we find out that the raiders are looking for the Rod of Daybreak. So if you've been keeping up with the High Republic, that term is going to sound very familiar to us by now. We know that the Rod of Daybreak is partially what controls the Leveler. And we find this out when there's a moment where Tay is beating up one of the raiders in order to try to run them out of the temple. And Tay overhears one of the raiders mentioning the Rod of Daybreak, but Tay doesn't know what that is yet. So us as the reader, we know by now, but Tay doesn't know. He just can tell that it sounds like this is like an item of importance based on the fact that these raiders are looking for that specifically. And meanwhile, while Tay is breaking out of the Temple of the Kyber, there is still that riot going on outside of the convocation, and there's actually a building that's falling down, and Vildar is trying to prevent this from happening, but he's unsuccessful, and the building does end up coming crashing down. And so Vildar and some other people who we later find out to be Path members are trapped underneath the rubble of this collapsed building. There's also a moment around this time where Olivia sees a glimpse of the mother, like from a distance during the riot, and Olivia immediately can tell that this is her long lost sister. So if you've read Path of Vengeance already, that's going to sound very familiar to you. When I made my Path of Vengeance video and when I made my sneak peek video, kind of like giving you recommended reading order for Path of Vengeance, I highly recommended getting caught up on this comic first, just because there's so many little details that intertwine with Path of Vengeance, and this is one of them. So like in Path of Vengeance, we already know that Olivia's looking for the mother. And I mean, I'm almost hesitant to say this because it is kind of like a Path of Vengeance spoiler in a way, but if you read the comic first, it's not a spoiler because you already know what the connection is between Olivia and her mother. So I'm just going to say it. Just know that if you haven't read Path of Vengeance yet, there's going to be spoilers for Path of Vengeance in this video. Olivia knows that the mother's her sister, and right after Olivia realizes that, Olivia and Master Lebon have to go to the final pilgrim statue because it's under attack. So the pilgrim statue, that's that big Jedi statue that we see that's fallen down in Rogue One, that's already been mentioned multiple times in phase 2 of the High Republic. It's that big massive Jedi statue that's like pretty it's like pretty iconic on Jeddah. And so that statue is under attack. And at first, when they hear this, Olivia's like, why is the statue under attack? But Master Lebon's like, there's no time to explain, we just gotta go. And when they get there, we do find out how exactly the statue was knocked down. We know that it was knocked down at some point during the battle, but we didn't know exactly what the mechanics of that were. And we find out that the attackers, they placed explosives around the statue and deliberately like detonated them so the statue would collapse. And even though Olivia and Master Lebon are there and they witness this, there's not anything that they can do about it. It's just something that happens. They're outnumbered. The explosives were already placed. It was a done deal before they even got there, really. And that's where issue 5 leaves off, and then we're getting into issue 6, which is called The Day the Statue Fell. At the start of this issue, we pick back up with Vildar, who is trapped beneath the rubble, and he is okay, and so are the people under there, but he's using the Force to hold up the rubble, and it is proving to be incredibly difficult. But yet, here we have another lifting rocks example, which I love it. Anytime a Jedi is lifting rocks, it just makes me happy because it makes me think of that Last Jedi line and all the times all of our favorite Jedi have lifted up rocks. So I just love that image. I'm glad that that was included in here. It's a nice little it's like a nice little reference to other films and stories in which that we have Jedi doing that. But anyway, so he's holding up the rocks and there's Path members under there with him, and one of the Path members under there is like being nice to him and is like trying to be like encouraging, but another Path member is like berating him the whole time that he's holding up the rocks that are like, he's the only thing stopping these rocks from killing them all. And so why is this Path member berating him as he's doing this? That is just like, it's just a testament to like how some of the Path is like completely like way extreme, way lost touch with reality. And then there's other parts of the Path where like you have some people that are like more normal. And so that was like an interesting contrast to see in this scene between those two characters. And during this scene where Vildar is holding up these rocks, he's also thinking about this memory which has pretty much been with him since the start of this comic series and really his whole life, which is when he was a child and a dark side Force user came to his village and was really doing a lot of damage to the village, and this is something that really traumatized him. And so while he's lifting up the rocks, he's like giving it all his strength that he has. He's really struggling. It's like one of the most difficult things he's had to do, and during this time that memory is with him. We do find out during that memory that there was a Jedi who came and defeated that dark side user and saved him, and that's how Vildar ended up becoming a Jedi, is because Master Larty, which was the name of that Jedi who showed up, ended up taking him under his wing and training him. Meanwhile, while all that's going on, we see Tay still at the Temple of the Kyber, who he's fighting off the raiders, and they also just kind of decide to leave because it's pretty clear that the Rod of Daybreak is not there. But even though they decide to leave on their own, Tay was still doing a pretty good job of holding his own against them because, as we learned in previous issues, he's a former guardian of the will, so he pretty much knows what he's doing in a fight. And after the raiders leave, the Temple of the Kyber is sealed, so nobody in or out. And Tay is once again frustrated with the Guardians of the Wills because he feels like they need to be doing more during the battle to try to help the people that are caught in the middle of it. The Guardians of the Wills are trained fighters. Like they're pretty much just as skilled as the Jedi when it comes to being able to beat people up. So like why are they not out there fighting? This is the whole reason that Tay is no longer with the Guardians of the Wills, is because he previously had an experience which we learned about in previous issues, so I won't get too into it here. But he had a previous experience where he felt like the Guardians of the Wills had lost touch with what's important. They were putting their duty to the Temple of the Kyber above actual people, and that was something that Tay took a real issue with. Tay, once again, he's like, we gotta help these people. Like, he's really getting in their face about it, which is kind of how he is. He's very like outspoken and passionate about what he believes, which is one reason I love this character. And thankfully, Tay is successful in convincing them, because they do end up getting off their butts and going to help Vildar. And it was a pretty cool moment, because when they get there, Vildar is still really struggling. And so the Guardians of the Wills start the "I'm one with the Force is with me" chant. And so everybody's like chanting it, and it's like helping Vildar, and he's like feeling encouraged, and they're pulling the rocks off. And so he was able to, like, because he had the support of everybody else, he was able to like finish pushing the rocks off of them. And that's how everybody ended up being okay. It wasn't just Vildar on his own, it was also the support that he had from the other people who showed up to help him. Tay, Vildar, and Maddie, they get the hurt people out of there, try to get them out of the way of the fighting, and they're going to try to go find a place for them to kind of ride the rest of this out. And since they can't get to a med center safely, they end up going to the bar Enlightenment. And this bar has been featured in other Phase 2 stories. The bartender is named Creighton. He is like a kooky, funny guy who's really good at getting information. And some quick version of who he is he's like weird, but he seems like a nice dude. So when we pick back up with issue 7, which is called The Siege of Enlightenment, that's what's going on. Is they're all trying to convince Creighton, the bartender, and the owner of the bar, to let them in. And at first Creighton doesn't want to, because he's trying to close the bar because there's a battle going on outside. But Creighton eventually tells Vildar that if they help protect Enlightenment, then Enlightenment will help protect them. And something that is worth noting about Vildar's character in this scene is that when he shows up with all of the people to Enlightenment, you can see that one of the people that shows up with him was the Path member that was berating him when he was holding the rocks up. And even though Vildar does seem to not have a very good handle on his emotions, when I saw that, it made me kind of be like, okay, you know what? He's a good guy. He just at times is not good with his emotions. Because can you imagine, like, if you're holding up all these rocks and it's like the hardest thing that you've ever done, and somebody whose life you were saving was just like trash talking you the whole time? Like, I can't imagine how infuriating that would be. So the fact that he brought this person with them to Enlightenment, despite how nasty they were acting, it made me think pretty highly of this character. Like, I feel like he was already winning me over with time, but I feel like when I saw that, he like won me over completely. And while they're all at Enlightenment, eventually the rioters, they do show up to Enlightenment, and they end up having to bar the doors. And while they're all stuck in there, there's some interesting conversation that happens between everybody now that they're all in the same room and they all kind of have a moment to think. We find out that Maddie knows what the Rod of Daybreak is. She doesn't know a lot of details about it. She still doesn't know about the Leveler, but she's heard of it before in her studies. So she kind of at least has some background information. And so that's how her and Tay talking about the Rod of Daybreak, because Tay had overheard the Raiders talking about it, they're all able to come to the conclusion that the riot and everything else that happened was a diversion for those raiders to try to get the Rod of Daybreak. And that also tracks with what they were talking about in issue 5, where the Jedi were thinking that the feeling that the Leveler was causing, it was a deliberate thing that was done to cause this feeling. It wasn't an accident or a coincidence. And also during this conversation, in addition to that big plot realization, we also have Maddie and Vildar kind of working out like some of what Vildar's issues are. So we find out that the person who attacked Vildar's village when he was a kid was a sorcerer of Tund. And so we know that because another sorcerer of Tund was in the room as well. And so when they're all talking about it, the sorcerer was like, "Oh yeah, I actually remember like hearing about that situation and what occurred. Like the reason that that happened is because that guy who did that was expelled from being a sorcerer of Tund because he was a dark side user. He was like embracing the dark side too much, and so that's why he was expelled and that's why he was doing stuff like that." And so Maddie also realizes that the reason that Vildar ended up turning down the post with the Togrutas and coming to Jeddah is because he was looking for like a position that would be emotionally lower stakes, because he does have concerns about situations getting like too high pressure, too high stress, just because of his own past that he's had. And that is something, him turning down the position with the Togrutas, that is something that was mentioned like way back at the beginning of this series, where I was kind of thinking like, okay, there's something there. Like it sounds like there's a reason that he turned down that position, but at the time we didn't know what it was. And so that's the reason, is because it just relates back to like his own issues that he's had as a result of the traumatic event that happened to him before he became a Jedi. Maddie and Vildar are having this conversation about this issue of Vildar's. It does lead to them like connecting more and kind of like building more of a relationship between them, because Maddie's able to like Vildar's able to be honest about what his issues are. Maddie's able to be there and listen to him, and so it does end up being a good thing that this has all come out and was discussed. Meanwhile, while that conversation is going on at Enlightenment, Olivia and Master Liban, they are still at the fallen statue. Olivia wants to get out of there, but Master Liban says, no, we have to stay and protect. And Olivia's like, protect what? Like, this is a statue. But Master Liban seems to know more about what the importance of this statue is, more than Olivia has knowledge of. But before Master Liban can explain it, the same raiders from the Temple of the Kyber that Tay saw, the same ones show up here at the statue. So at this point, we can tell that the statue in some way must be housing the rod, because when the raiders get there, they seem pretty certain that what they're looking for is going to be there. And then after that, the next time that we check back in with Olivia and Master Liban, Olivia is calming Vildar, saying that the raiders have taken Master Liban and Olivia is in serious trouble. And while she's talking to Vildar, she is stabbed in the gut with a lightsaber by one of the raiders. And that is where issue 7 ends. So that's like a pretty massive cliffhanger for issue 7 to end on. But yeah, once again, I really like the direction that this series is going in. And even though typically comic issues are going to be pretty short, that's just part of the game, it feels like there's a lot that happens in each issue. Like they feel like it feels like we're getting almost like a full story within each one. And so I really like that about this series. I'm really enjoying the way that it's unfolded. I also really love how it's connecting so closely with Path of Vengeance, because I feel like this is something that's going to encourage people to give the comics a try who maybe haven't in the past. And I just love how we have two stories that are different mediums connecting to each other so closely. I just think that's a really cool way to do this. With High Republic, of course, things we already expect them to connect, but I feel like it's unique the level with which this comic and the novel Path of Vengeance connect together. It just feels like it's like way more connected than we typically see with this sort of thing. So I'm really enjoying how those two things are intertwining together. But stay tuned for my next video where I'm going to be covering further issues of this series. But in the meantime, let me know what you've been thinking of it so far. Especially if you've read Path of Vengeance already, let me know what you think about how Path of Vengeance tied into this story. And thanks so much for watching, y'all, and I hope y'all have a great rest of your day. Bye, guys.